Okay, so imagine you're sitting across from someone you really care about, and you're looking at a red apple on the table between you.
Right, just a normal apple.
Yeah, exactly. You point to it,
Hmm.
and they just look you dead in the eye and say, that apple is blue. And, that you are completely crazy for thinking it's red.
Which is just instantly maddening.
Totally. Because in almost every area of life, we just kind of operate on the assumption that communication solves everything, right? We think, well, if I just explain my point of view, they'll understand.
But today's research file completely shatters that assumption. We are looking at what happens when someone doesn't just disagree with you, but they literally, physically, and psychologically lack the mental hardware to share your reality.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. Today we are taking a really fascinating stack of notes from Frank Research, and we're going on a bit of a mission for you.
Yeah, we're taking this massive buzzword. I mean, narcissism is everywhere right now, and we're looking at the actual machinery underneath it.
Right, breaking down the scientific origins and the devastating environment it creates for children. Plus the deeply twisted logic behind why narcissistic individuals feel, completely entitled to cheat, manipulate, and just rewrite history.
And we really need to set the stage here early on, because when you hear the word narcissist, you probably just picture someone, I don't know, taking too many selfies, or maybe a coworker who just talks over everyone in meetings.
Right, just somebody's a little full of themselves.
Exactly. But we aren't talking about vanity today. What these research notes reveal is a deeply complex, really tragic personality structure, and it's built around a surprisingly fragile ego and a fundamental lack of empathy.
Which is exactly why this matters to you listening right now, whether you've dealt with a highly difficult boss, navigated a really toxic relationship with an ex, or, maybe you're just insanely curious about human behavior.
It's the ultimate aha moment.
It really is, because it explains why your normal rational strategies for dealing with certain people just bounce right off them, like completely fail.
Because, honestly, you are trying to play chess on a board where they are playing by entirely different rules. And to understand the game, we really have to look at how that board is built.
Right, so let's get into that. Is a narcissist born or are they made? Because the data in these notes completely blew my mind.
You thought it was just learned behavior, right?
Totally. I always assumed this was purely, someone gets spoiled, they never hear the word no, and boom, they turn into a narcissist. But the research points to actual genetics.
It does. It's pretty staggering.
It estimates that traits like entitlement have a 35% heritability rate. 35%.
Which is a massive chunk of the puzzle.
That means more than a third of that deeply ingrained belief that, I deserve more than everyone else, the rules do not apply to me, that is literally poured into their foundation before they even take their first breath.
And it goes even deeper than genetics, actually. It is highly visible in the neurobiology itself.
Really? Like brain scans?
Yeah, exactly. When you look at brain scans of individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, they actually show reduced gray matter in the anterior insula and the prefrontal cortex.
Wait, let me stop you there. Reduced gray matter. Is this like a muscle that just hasn't been exercised because they were raised poorly? Or are they literally missing the physical capacity to feel what I'm feeling?
It's more like a processor bottleneck in a computer. Gray matter facilitates the signals in your brain, and empathy, the ability to hold your own reality and someone else's reality in your mind at the exact same time, that takes a massive amount of processing power.
Oh, wow. I never thought about empathy as a processing task.
Right, but it is. So without enough gray matter in those specific areas, the emotional resonance we call empathy just doesn't compute efficiently. They physically lack the bandwidth to easily put themselves in your shoes.
Okay, so that's the hardware issue, the biological side. But the Frank Research notes also dive into the environment, right? The nurture side of things. And honestly, the section on parenting completely threw me.
The paradox. Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's a massive paradox. It outlines that narcissism can stem from severe childhood trauma and neglect, which, makes sense as a defense mechanism. But then it also says it can come from the exact opposite extreme.
Parents who treat their kid like a golden god.
Right. How can completely opposite extremes build the exact same personality disorder? It doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, if you look really closely at both of those extremes, they actually share the exact same core wound. In both scenarios, the child is not being seen for who they truly are.
Okay, unpack that a bit for me. Let's start with the neglect side.
Sure. So when a child is abused or emotionally neglected, their day-to-day reality is entirely too painful to bear. They are utterly powerless. So to survive that environment, their psyche constructs a grand, untouchable, false self.
Like a psychological suit of armor.
Exactly like armor. They mentally disassociate from the frightened, vulnerable child they actually are, and they invent this persona that doesn't need anyone. Someone who is inherently superior and untouchable.
Wow, okay, I totally see how that creates the armor. But what about the overvalued child? The kid whose parents just constantly tell them they are a genius and better than everyone else.
It seems great on the surface, but the overvalued child is also denied the reality. They aren't loved for their normal, messy, flawed human self. They are idolized as a perfect object.
Oh man, so it's not real love.
No, it's highly conditional. The parent essentially says, you are superior to everyone else, and that superiority is the only reason I love you. So the child internalizes this grand false self because that is the absolute only version of them that receives affection.
If they show weakness, or just like average behavior, the love is withdrawn.
Precisely. In both cases, the neglected child and the overvalued child, the authentic self is just crushed. And what's left is this incredibly fragile ego, a mask, basically, that requires constant external validation just to survive.
So, okay, if the parent has this massive empty void where their self-worth should be, and they're constantly scrambling to keep this false self inflated, I mean, a child isn't really a separate human to them, are they?
No, not at all.
The child is just like an appliance, a tool to regulate the parent's self-esteem.
That is exactly it. And that brings us to what the sources refer to as the twilight zone. When a person with this specific psychological machinery becomes a parent, it creates a deeply distorted reality for the child.
Because the parent's emotional needs just suck up all the oxygen in the room.
Right. And it leads to this bizarre role reversal.
Parentification. The research highlights this heavily, and I want to be super clear here. We aren't just talking about a kid having to, do the laundry or cook dinner because mom or dad is busy working.
Oh no, it's far more insidious than that. The child realizes very, very early on, well, if I don't manage my parents' emotional outbursts, this house isn't safe.
So they become their parent's emotional bodyguard.
Exactly. You might have a 10-year-old who is entirely responsible for diffusing a parent's rage, or playing therapist to their mother's depression, or absorbing the blame for their father's failures, just to keep the peace.
The child's own developmental needs are just entirely secondary to stabilizing the parent. That is heartbreaking.
It is. And if the parent's reality is the only one that matters, they have to enforce that somehow.
Right, which brings up gaslighting. The notes mention this, but how does that actually play out day to day for a kid?
Gaslighting is essentially psychological warfare aimed at dismantling a person's trust in their own perception. For a child, it looks like a parent screaming at them in a rage and then an hour later saying, I never yelled at you, you have a terrible memory, you're always making things up.
And if this happens consistently, the child's brain realizes that trusting their own senses is literally dangerous.
Yes. To survive, they have to outsource their reality to the parent.
Because if you disagree with the parent, you risk losing the absolute only source of food, shelter, and love you have.
And remember, even that love is highly conditional. The sources point out that affection is only doled out when the child makes the parent look good.
It honestly sounds like the child is fundamentally acting as a PR representative for their own family.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. You are basically a prop in their grand play.
Which has to have massive long-term effects. I mean, if your entire childhood is spent acting as a PR rep, carefully managing the explosive emotions of an adult, and constantly being told your version of reality is wrong, that sounds like a recipe for chronic, debilitating anxiety.
It absolutely is. I mean, think about the nervous system of that child. If your safety depends entirely on making someone else look good, and you are constantly walking through a minefield of unpredictable reactions, you can never, ever relax.
You develop hypervigilance.
Exactly. Your brain is constantly scanning the room for micro-expressions of disappointment or anger.
And the perfectionism the sources talk about. Does that tie in here?
Definitely. Perfectionism isn't about healthy ambition for these kids. It's a survival strategy. If you are absolutely flawless, maybe you won't get criticized. Maybe you will finally earn a crumb of that conditional love.
But of course, the goalposts are always moving.
Always. Because the parent's ego is a bottomless pit.
Wow. And that hypervigilance doesn't just magically vanish when the kid turns 18. Which kind of pivots us to looking at how this Same exact mechanism, using people as emotional appliances, plays out in adult romantic relationships.
Right. The need for an audience follows them everywhere.
Because the research points out something deeply counterintuitive about why narcissistic individuals cheat. We generally assume infidelity is about, I don't know, a physical spark or a dead bedroom or falling out of love.
Which is how a neurotypical relationship might experience it.
Yeah, but the notes explicitly claim that for a narcissist, cheating is rarely about sexual desire.
Right. If you view cheating through normal motivations, you'll be confused. For the narcissist, cheating is a calculated strategic choice. It is fundamentally an ego supply chain issue.
An ego supply chain issue. Okay, I really need you to break that down.
Yeah.
If they have a long-term partner who loves them, isn't that enough supply?
You have to remember the paradox of intimacy. For a healthy person, the goal of a relationship is comfortable intimacy. It's being truly known, flaws and all, and being loved anyway.
Right, that's a dream.
But for a narcissist, being truly known is their biggest fear. Remember, their authentic self was crushed in childhood. They believe their true self is shameful and unlovable.
So they have to protect the mask at all costs.
Exactly. Their entire survival depends on maintaining that flawless, godlike, false self.
Well, I see. So at the beginning of the relationship, the new partner is perfect for this.
Yes. The new partner is a captivated audience. They only see the mask. They provide this intense, starry-eyed validation. But over time, as the relationship deepens, the partner inevitably starts to see the real person behind the mask.
They see the flaws, the insecurities, the bad moods.
And once the partner sees the real them, the partner's validation loses its value. The applause of someone who knows you aren't actually a god just doesn't feed the ego.
Comfortable intimacy literally feels like starving to death to them.
Precisely. So when the primary partner naturally stops reacting to the grand performance, the narcissist actively seeks out a new audience.
They need a stranger, someone who has no idea who they really are, just to give them that fresh, uncritical hit of adulation.
It's addiction to validation, pure and simple.
But wait, I have a major question here.
Yeah.
The hardware might be flawed, like we said, and the childhood trauma is real, but they are still adults operating in the real world. If they cheat and completely blow up their marriage, how do they deal with the guilt?
It's a great question.
Like, they must know they did something objectively destructive. Does it crush them?
That is the million-dollar question, and it takes us straight into the terrifying mental gymnastics of guilt erasure. You are assuming they process guilt the way you do.
Right.
But their internal machinery simply cannot handle it.
Because admitting fault would destroy the false self.
Yes. What's fascinating here is that beneath all that outward arrogance, a narcissist's internal critic is actually incredibly harsh. It is vicious.
Really, they seem so full of themselves.
It's a shield. If they were to genuinely accept responsibility for a major mistake, if they said, you know, I cheated and I destroyed my family, it wouldn't just make them feel bad. It would cause a total psychological collapse.
Wow. It would trigger an unendurable spiral of self-hatred.
Exactly. Being flawless and quote-unquote right is essential to their very identity.
So it's literally life or death for their ego, which means their brain just instantly goes to work rewriting history.
Yes. Psychological survival dictates that they must project the fault outward. They cannot physically tolerate the blame, so they hand it to you.
The research outlines this as a sort of cascading defense system using 4 specific justification maneuvers. Let's look at how this actually plays out in real time.
Let's do it.
Imagine a scenario where a narcissist gets caught red-handed sending romantic text messages to a coworker. The partner confronts them with the phone. What happens first?
The first line of defense is projection. They take their own bad behavior and immediately hurl the accusation at you.
So instead of addressing the text messages, what do?
They will attack you for looking at their phone. They'll say, why are you snooping? You must be the one who's cheating if you're this paranoid.
Oh, man. So it instantly deflects the attention and forces the victim to start defending themselves. You're suddenly arguing about your own trustworthiness instead of their infidelity.
Exactly. It's incredibly disorienting.
But let's say the partner doesn't take the bait. They hold their ground. What's the next maneuver?
If projection fails, they pivot seamlessly to victim playing. They construct a narrative where they had absolutely no choice but to do what they did, making themselves the true victim of the situation.
Wait, how do you make yourself the victim when you're the one texting a coworker?
They will rationalize that your shortcomings literally forced them to cheat. They'll say, you know, I only texted them because you've been so cold and distant lately. If you were a better partner, I wouldn't have to seek attention elsewhere.
That is just so... They completely invert the roles. the perpetrator becomes the victim of the actual victim. It's dizzying.
It really is.
Okay, but what if there's undeniable proof and the partner just says, no, you chose to do this. It's on you.
Then we drop to the third level, which is minimization. They might finally acknowledge the act, but they will completely strip it of its emotional weight.
How does that sound?
They will furiously patch the holes in their ego by saying, it was just a text message, you didn't mean anything. You are completely overreacting and being dramatic over nothing.
So they just drain the reality out of the event so it no longer threatens their self-image?
Right. They minimize the damage to minimize their own guilt.
And if all else fails, say the partner is packing their bags and walking out the door.
Then they fall back on the absolute bedrock of the disorder. Entitlement.
Entitlement. Let's talk about that.
It is the final shield. It is the deeply held belief that they are fundamentally above the moral standards that apply to the rest of humanity.
The rules just don't apply to them.
Exactly. In their mind, they work hard, they are special, and therefore they deserve special treatment. They believe the rules of loyalty, honesty, and basic decency simply do not apply to them, regardless of the devastation it causes.
Looking at this cascade projection, victim playing, minimization, entitlement, it all just snaps into focus. They are furiously patching holes in the hull of their ego.
It's constant maintenance.
It reminds me of someone intentionally picking up your absolute favorite coffee mug, looking you right in the eye and throwing it against the wall so it shatters into a million pieces.
Right.
And then without missing a beat, they genuinely believe they are the victim because you left the mug out on the counter where they could smash it. And they actually expect you to apologize for upsetting them.
That captures the sheer absurdity of it perfectly, and it answers the question you asked at the very beginning of this deep dive. Why can't you just talk it out with a difficult personality?
Because they refuse to share a baseline reality.
Exactly. Their desperate biological and psychological need to maintain control and avoid their own harsh internal critic makes true resolution literally impossible.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've covered incredible ground today. We've seen how reduced gray matter in the brain creates a physical processor bottleneck for empathy.
We really unpacked the hardware.
We did. And we've seen how extreme environments, whether it's the trauma of neglect or the gilded cage of overvaluation, crush the authentic self and birth that fragile false ego. We've explored how that creates the twilight zone of childhood, turning kids into hyper-vigilant emotional bodyguards.
Which carries so much weight.
It does. And finally, we've seen how that desperate need for an audience leads to calculated betrayals and a dizzying cascade of guilt erasure in adult relationships.
So the ultimate weapon against this kind of psychological distortion isn't arguing back. You aren't going to outlogic them. The weapon is understanding the machinery.
Right.
Once you see the lack of processing power, the frantic ego management, and the rewriting of history for what it is, a desperate survival mechanism for a fragile, false self, you stop trying to fix the reality.
You stop believing that your face is the problem when you are looking into a funhouse mirror.
Beautifully put. You recognize the parentification, you spot the projection, and you start protecting your own reality.
Exactly. The source material we reviewed from Frank Research actually wraps up by pointing out that there are real strategies and resources out there for setting boundaries against this specific type of psychological abuse.
Which is so important to know.
It is. And that leaves us with a final, fascinating thought for you to mull over. We now know that a narcissistic individual relies entirely on an external audience for validation. They need you to react, to argue, to play the game, so they can use you to survive their own vicious inner critic.
They desperately need that supply.
Right. So what happens to their psyche when the target of their abuse finally sees the machinery, sets a hard boundary, walks away, and completely removes the audience?
It's a very powerful, paradigm-shifting question.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because if you pull the blueprints out from under the house and take away the weather, well, what's left standing? Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Imagine discovering that the person you've been married to for like 10 years has completely rewritten the history of your relationship just to make themselves the victim of a betrayal that they actually committed against you.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
Right. Or, imagine finding out your boss engineered this massive failure in your department, specifically so they could swoop in, publicly rescue the project, and take all the credit.
It happens more than you'd think.
Exactly. And, when we casually throw around the word narcissist just because someone posts too many gym selfies, we really completely miss the terrifying, destructive psychological machinery operating underneath true clinical narcissism.
We really do. I mean, we do a massive disservice to the complexity of human psychology when we just reduce a devastating structural deficit into a pop culture buzzword.
Yeah, totally.
When we strip away that colloquial use of the term, we are left looking at a profound distortion of reality. It's a mechanism that doesn't just alter how a person sees themselves, but it systematically dismantles the psychological well-being of anyone caught in their gravitational pull.
And that is exactly what we're dissecting for you today. We are pulling from an incredible set of psychological data and excerpts from Frank research.
Some really groundbreaking stuff in there.
Right. So the mission of this deep dive is to look past those casual labels and uncover the actual mechanics of narcissism. We're going to explore the neurobiology behind it, how it permanently alters a child's developing brain.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It really is. And how it creates a culture of fear in the corporate workplace, and exactly how a narcissist bypasses their own cognitive dissonance to justify betrayal. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Before we can even look at the blast radius, we really have to understand the genesis, right? We tend to view narcissism as an attitude problem, like a series of selfish choices.
Right, but this research points heavily toward biology.
Really? Biology?
Yeah, it is fundamentally a nature and nurture cocktail, but the biological baseline is much stronger than people realize. The Frank research highlights some truly compelling data on heritability.
Okay, so it can actually be passed down.
Exactly. For example, specific narcissistic traits like grandiosity and entitlement, they actually show an estimated heritability rate of around 35%.
Wow. 35%? That's significant.
It is, but the biology goes much deeper than just inherited traits. What's fascinating here is what we see in the neurobiology of individuals diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder.
Okay, what are we seeing in the brain?
Brain imaging shows distinct structural anomalies. Specifically, we see less gray matter in the left anterior insula and the prefrontal cortex.
Wait, let me pause you right there. Because the left anterior insula, that's essentially the brain's emotional routing center, right?
Spot on, yeah.
It's heavily involved in interoception, like translating physical sensations into emotional states. So if there is a literal physical deficit in that region, does that mean they lack the neurological hardware to physically feel the gut punch of someone else's sadness? Like, they literally cannot simulate empathy.
That is precisely what the current neurobiological models suggest. Empathy isn't just some philosophical concept.
Right.
It is a measurable physical process where your brain actively simulates the emotional state of another person. And in a narcissistic brain, the physical mechanism for mirroring those emotions is just underdeveloped.
That is wild to think about. It's a physical limitation.
It is, but, and this is crucial, having that biological predisposition does not guarantee someone will become a narcissist. Biology loads the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
Ah, okay. So where does the environment come in?
The research points to early childhood parenting as the primary catalyst, and it specifically highlights two extreme ends of the parenting spectrum, which are overvaluation and severe neglect.
Okay, well, overvaluation makes intuitive sense. Like, if a parent constantly drills into a child's head that they are fundamentally superior, flawless, entitled to special treatment, you're essentially demanding the child adopt a grandiose identity, right? Just to secure the parent's approval.
Exactly. You're building a false ego from day one.
But the other end of the spectrum, severe neglect and abuse that seems kind of counterintuitive to me, how does being treated as worthless produce grandiosity?
It's a great question. It produces grandiosity as a profound psychological defense mechanism.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So when a child is living in a terrifying or emotionally barren environment, the reality of being fundamentally unloved is just too agonizing for their psyche to process.
Right, it's too much for a kid to handle.
Precisely. So to survive, the child psychologically dissociates. They split off from their vulnerable, authentic self, and they construct this impenetrable, grandiose, false self.
Wow.
And this false self, it doesn't need love, it demands admiration. It's basically a fortress built to protect a deeply shattered core from ever feeling that original pain again.
Okay, so it's essentially an architecture of trauma. Like, if the genetic predisposition is like building on a fault line, lacking the structural support for emotional mirroring, and the builders, meaning the parents, either demand the house look like a royal palace or completely abandon the construction site.
Right.
You end up with an incredibly fragile facade. So it's like building a house on a faulty foundation. The house might look like a fortress on the outside, but internally, there are just no load-bearing walls.
That is an excellent structural comparison.
Yeah.
And, because there are no load-bearing walls, the entire structure requires constant, exhausting 247 maintenance to prevent a collapse.
Because it can't stand on its own.
Exactly. The narcissist cannot maintain that false self alone. They require the people around them to constantly hold the walls up. And the people most heavily burdened with that impossible task are usually the narcissist's own children.
Which takes us to the darkest part of this research, honestly. The data describes the environment created for children of narcissistic parents as a twilight zone.
A very accurate term for it.
Yeah, and looking at the 4 core pillars of this specific trauma, which are damaged self-worth, parentification, gaslighting, and conditional love, you can really see how it systematically dismantles a child's reality. I mean, damaged self-worth is obvious, right? All the emotional oxygen in the room belongs to the parent.
Always. The child's needs are always secondary.
But parentification is where the structural inversion really happens.
Exactly. Because the parent's emotional regulation is completely stunted, the child is essentially drafted into the role of the parent's emotional caretaker.
Which is so backwards.
It is. You see young children acting as therapists during a parent's rage spiral, or mediating adult conflicts, or just trying to manage the parent's incredibly fragile ego.
It sounds like being an unpaid, full-time PR manager for a highly volatile, totally unpredictable celebrity, except you're like 8 years old.
That's exactly what it feels like for them.
Your entire worth is based on how well you manage their public image and soothe their tantrums.
And if that PR manager fails, or if they, heaven forbid, try to point out the parent's volatile behavior, they are immediately hit with the third pillar, which is gaslighting.
Ah, the reality distortion.
Yes. The parent will relentlessly deny reality to maintain their flawless image. They'll say things like, "I never said that," or "You're imagining things," or "You're just overly sensitive."
Which has to be so crazy-making for a kid.
It is. And over time, this doesn't just confuse a child. It actively alters their neural pathways.
Wait, really? It changes their brain?
Yes. When a child's perception of reality is constantly invalidated by their primary caregiver, their amygdala, the brain's fear center stays chronically activated.
Oh, wow.
This constant state of hypervigilance actively disrupts the development of the brain circuits that are responsible for reality testing and self-trust.
That neurological angle is crucial. Like if your brain is just marinating in cortisol because your caregiver is constantly altering the facts of your existence, you literally lose the biological ability to trust your own memory.
Precisely. You become entirely tethered to whatever reality the parent dictates.
And that tether is reinforced by the 4th pillar, right? Conditional love.
Yes. Affection isn't a baseline in these homes. It's a transaction.
So you only get love when your accomplishments serve as a mirror reflecting the parent's supposed greatness.
Exactly. And that transactional view of human beings, honestly, is the hallmark of the disorder. People are not viewed as independent entities with their own needs. They're viewed as appliances.
Appliances? That's a cold way to look at it.
It is, but think about it. A refrigerator exists to keep your food cold. A child, a partner, or a colleague exists to regulate the narcissist's self-esteem. When the appliance stops working the way they want, it is kicked, discarded, or replaced.
Wow. Well, that transactional framework naturally forces us to look at what happens when these children grow up, or when the narcissist enters the adult world.
Right.
Let's look at the corporate workplace first, because the Frank research highlights how this fragile ego completely devastates professional environments. They don't just act like bad bosses.
No, they fundamentally reorganize the corporate hierarchy around their pathology.
They absolutely do. In a workplace, a narcissist categorizes everyone into one of 3 roles, right? A threat, a tool, or an audience.
Yes. And they manage upward with incredible charm and mirroring. They convince superiors that they are indispensable visionaries.
Right. But laterally, with their peers, it's a completely different story. It's a zero-sum game of sabotage. Like, they view any colleague's success as a direct threat to their own grandiosity.
And downwards, with their subordinates, they rule through a culture of fear and credit theft.
Right, because if people are just appliances, like you said, a subordinate's hard work belongs to the narcissist by default.
Exactly.
So if the department has a massive win, the narcissist steps right in front of the cameras to absorb the praise. But if the project fails, they immediately find a scapegoat, sacrificing the subordinate to protect their false self.
That's right. They groom what psychology often refers to as flying monkeys.
Like from The Wizard of Oz?
Exactly. These are subordinates or peers who are manipulated into doing the narcissist's bidding. They enforce their rules, and they isolate anyone who dares to question the narcissist's competence.
So the workplace just becomes this paranoid, hyper-political battleground where the actual work is secondary to managing the narcissist's ego?
It's exhausting for everyone involved.
Which brings us to how this exact same dynamic plays out in intimate partnerships. Because if the workplace is where they extract status, romantic relationships are where they extract identity.
Very well put.
The research dives heavily into the mechanics of betrayal in these relationships, particularly why narcissists cheat. And it fundamentally redefines the motive.
It really does. It's rarely about sexual gratification.
Right. It's a strategic extraction of ego fuel.
Yes, it is about the absolute necessity of a quote-unquote new audience.
A new audience. Okay, unpack that for us.
Well, over time, in a long-term partnership, the initial idealization phase inevitably fades. A healthy partner begins to see the narcissist as a complete human being, flaws and all, and they offer stable, realistic love.
Which sounds great to a normal person.
Exactly. But for the false self, stable love is starving. They don't want to be known. They want to be worshipped. So a new partner, an affair, provides pure, uncritical, unblemished validation. The new audience only sees the flawless mask.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push back on the logic of this mechanism a bit.
Sure.
Normally, you and I think of cheating as purely physical or just a lack of self-control, but based on this research, it's actually a desperate survival mechanism for their ego. Like a dying star that has to consume nearby planets just to keep shining.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it, yes.
But if their entire psychological survival depends on maintaining this flawless public image, getting caught cheating would absolutely obliterate that image, right?
Logically, yes.
It would expose them as a liar and a betrayer, which would theoretically cause a massive collapse of their false self. So why take such a catastrophic risk? It seems entirely counterproductive to their core goal.
That is a highly logical observation. But you are applying rational risk assessment to a pathological need. Think of it like an addiction.
Okay.
The immediate, overwhelming starvation for adoration completely overrides their long-term executive functioning. But more